Christian Wakeford, you're 37. You were a Conservative Party member for nearly 20 years. You'd become a Conservative councillor in May 2013. You're now a Labour MP. What happened?
I think, to be fair, when we got down here, it was a lot of excitement. It was all new. It was, even on the night of the count, no one really knew what was happening other than a big landslide victory. And you would think with that you could really do some radical transformative change for the benefit of the country. Yes, we've had COVID, but where's the change? Where's the actual improvement been? And on the back of that, with threats to my constituency, if I didn't vote a particular way, I wouldn't get a new high school, or I'd hold back an entire town's regeneration for me voting a particular way. And there's only so much of the threats, the broken promises of this bill isn't quite the right place for this amendment. It will come forward in the next bill, and then you realise it hasn't. And to some level, that's naivety of being new and trusting. But again, there's only so many times you can have a broken promise before you think, well, it's not coming, is it? So between that and actually voting, against my better judgment on things that I care about, I think it got to the point where I couldn't stay any longer. And after the best part of 20 years, that was a huge decision to come to. Many sleepless nights and almost a kind of existential identity crisis. But through kind of talking through it, internal monologue style, and kind of coming to that conclusion that actually the matters that I do care about, whether it was social mobility, alcohol harm, or actually international aid, etc. The Conservatives weren't even talking about it, let alone trying to offer a meaningful solution. And I found myself agreeing more and more with Keir, and it just felt like a natural fit by that point.
It's a hard thing to do, because being in a political party, it's a bit like being in a family. And how are you? Are you okay?
I'm good. Apart from the first couple of weeks where it felt very much like a rabbit in the headlights, that PMQs was awful. I think generally my greatest achievement was not throwing up on the back of Keir's head, and I'm sure he's grateful for that too.
Tell me why it was awful.
Well, you'll remember just the way Parliament's set up. You're literally staring at 300 of your former friends and colleagues trying not to make eye contact whilst trying to make eye contact. And there were heckles, there was abusive language, and there's been some apologies. And do I expect people to agree with me? No. If they did, they'd be crossing the floor with me. But I hope they understand that actually it's not been an easy decision to come to, but it's one that I genuinely think was the right decision for not only for me, but for my constituents and ultimately the country.
I understand just from reading that you were the one to approach the Labour Party. Can you remember who you first spoke to? You don't have to tell me anything that you would rather not.
Actually, it was kind of a bit of a mix. It was kind of approaches through friends in the PLP saying, actually, the leadership are really liking some of the things you're saying, whether it was on universal credit when I was at Conservative Party conference, and I didn't really hold my punches then. When we got to the Owen Paterson issue, and I was certainly outspoken on that one. It then got to a point where there was approaches, and I just got to a point where I couldn't take it anymore. So I agreed to meet, and obviously whilst being on crutches, I couldn't go too far away from parliamentary estate, because it took a long time at that point. But it was the starting of the meetings, and I guess the rest is history.
And how far in advance did you start those meetings before you crossed the floor?
I guess the first proper meeting would have been late November, early December. So it got to that point, coupled just before Christmas. Intentionally took a step back to actually relax, recuperate from 10 weeks on crutches with a broken ankle, and actually kind of have some of that kind of deep thought as to there are only so many meetings I can have before really there's no turning back. So we agreed to meet again on the
When you
day
say
after.
we, is it was Keir? Or are you prefer not to name the person?
I mean, it's been well reported so far. It was Chris Elmore.
Who you'd become friends with or chatted with, and
Yeah, so a lot of meetings kind of off the estate, and very, very shortly afterwards, I think the academic side of it very much being when, not if, it was then trying to kind of overcome the emotional side, because a lot, like I said, after 20 years, there's a lot of friendships, almost family, within the Conservative Party, and trying to kind of get to that kind of thought pattern as to, I'm going to do this, but it's going to hurt them, and it's going to really hurt people that I care deeply about. They're my friends, I've campaigned with them, they're colleagues, they're people I admire, and it will hurt, but there's no other way to do it.
Does it still hurt?
It does, and yeah, I think the negative comments have stopped. It's more of a blanking from some friends, and they're friends of kind of 12, 13, 14 years, and it will take a long time, because they're the ones who will feel the most hurt, will feel the most betrayed, and will things ever be the same again? I doubt it, but I genuinely hope there is a way back to that friendship, because friends do mean a lot to me.
Friendship shouldn't be based on what anybody's politics are. They're based, you would hope, on something.
Yeah, and to be fair, there are some who will still openly give me a hug in the middle of Portcullis House, and that's really nice, and actually meant a lot over the last couple of weeks. It will just take some time, I think.
And just to explain to people watching, the House of Commons tea room. So it is like a CAF, but you sit in different bits of that CAF depending on your party allegiance. However, when you're queuing to pick up your toastie or your cup of coffee, then everybody is in that queue. I mean, things like that must be emotionally difficult in case you're stood next to somebody from your former party.
I mean, it was probably more the anticipation of a lot of these first things. So kind of going back into the chamber for the first time, although I chose my debate quite wisely, 'cause who's going to heckle me when I'm talking about the Holocaust? But yeah, going to the tea room, going to strangers, going through Portcullis House, and trying to actually meet people, but not meet people at the same time. It was tough, but I think we got through all that, and yeah, I mean, I think the benefit on the Labour side is there's comfy chairs, which is brilliant. But yeah, it was tough to begin with, but I think we've got through that now. And
I'm not going to ask you, because it's a private matter, but one of your former Conservative colleagues, it was that hugged you in Portcullis recently, was it?
Mm. Yeah, it was.
And that meant a lot to you, it would? Because somebody recognised that's pain, that you, to undergo the process, which you're convinced is the right process, but it's a painful one nonetheless. Yeah. Fascinating, and you'll continue on this journey, and I'm sure there'll be highs and struggles along the way, but thanks for opening up about that.
Yeah, well, I think I was certainly more anxious about my first CLP meeting.
Than I know all about Labour Party meetings.
Yeah, then I was about going to Kyiv, and that was a potential war zone at the time, and it was again, it was kind of one of those of rebuilding bridges with former colleagues, but building bridges with new colleagues. And again, I'm not expecting anyone to be my best friend on day one, but hopefully they see it's sincere, and I'm committed to this as much as anyone.
Way before you had moved to change parties, I was desperate to speak to you for one of these interviews. For this reason, which I'd like you to explain what happened to your family on the night of February the 13th, 2015.
So on that night, and my brother had recently been living with me on the back of his marriage breakdown. So we chatted that day, as one would do with their brother. But shortly after 11 o'clock at night, I got a knock on the door by the police to tell me that Mark had been in an accident and he'd died on the motorway. It turns out he was over the limits quite substantially, and we knew that he'd had a dependency issue. But at one point we got him sectioned and tried to get mental health support for him. But in order to really do that, you need to tackle the mental health and the alcohol dependency, and I don't think both were attempted to be tackled at the same time. So whilst we knew there was drinking, it was trying to normalise that and say, well, if you want to drink, we'll drink with you, to try and overcome some of those boundaries. But it then transpired that actually whilst he was doing that, there was a lot of secret drinking as well. And whilst no one chooses to be an addict, it's very difficult to help at the same time. So, I then had to, go in the back of a police car to identify my brother. And, for that day, there are still a lot of questions I can't ask. There's probably still to this day a lot of anger and, all the stages of grief that you can't really go through because, you can't ask any of the questions to anyone. And through the work I've been doing, certainly down here, I've been able to understand it a lot more. Does it lessen the hurt? No. But, in the education I've given myself, it means that at least I can almost comprehend and understand, the troubles of problem drinking and how that can escalate very, very quickly.
When were you aware that your brother had a drink problem?
Probably about the November. So it was the December when we'd taken him to hospital because he was in a state where he was literally crying out for help. And what do you do when it's your older brother? You try to find that help, and even just trying to find a mental health bed was a challenge, let alone with any alcohol speciality. So certainly at the time, signposting was poor. I think it's still a postcode lottery now, and some places are brilliant. I mean, I didn't even know I had an alcohol specialist ward in my own constituency until I was in a meeting that I was chairing, and one of the nurses happened to be there, and we got chatting, and we've spoken quite a few times now. But if you don't know what's in your own constituency when you're a member of Parliament, then how are you going to know that as a member of the public who actually just wants to know what support they can get, what help they can get, and who to speak to?
And so Mark developed a drink problem, you think, as a result of his marriage breakdown. So it wasn't something you remember. He was, it was always been there as he was growing up.
Not that I'm aware from growing up, and whether it was before the marriage breakdown, the cause of the marriage breakdown, I don't know. Yeah. But it was certainly there, and I think when we were finding bottles of vodka around the house, and ultimately in his car as well, that's when we started realising that actually this was a lot more than just liking a drink. And there are many people who like a drink, but this was clearly something a lot more and a lot worse.
What's the impact that something so shocking as the loss of the most loved person to you and your mum and dad, obviously?
Yeah, well, I mean, it rips the heart out of the family. I mean, my twin brother doesn't really talk about it. To be the one having to ring round family that night to say, look, you need to come around first thing in the morning to go through it, and having to drive to one of my older brothers to tell him and his dad that actually this had happened. It's a weekend that I'll never forget, but really don't want to relive in any form, because it fundamentally changed everything overnight.
And how important is it for you to campaign on the services that are available to those who are drink dependent?
Well, it's not even just that. There are things we can do quite quickly and quite easily, and whether it's changing alcohol labelling. So actually there's the calorific content, but actually full health warnings on there, like there would be with cigarette packages, to actually try to change the Equalities Act to make addiction. So at the moment there's a memorandum of exclusion because addiction is still seen as a personal choice. So what can we do to actually get that as a protected characteristic? Maybe not with access to benefit, but at least so your employer has a duty of care to look after you. Yeah. These are all things that could be done very quickly if there was the will to do so. I mean, we saw in the budget last year that actually talking about alcohol duty in a public health messaging, that was almost a paradigm shift, and it went down very well with the APPG. We just need to do more and go further. But on the back of asking a question about an alcohol strategy nearly 2 years ago, I seem to have got pushed into the national limelight for kind of campaigning on this issue, and I'm nothing special. I just happen to have a platform where I get to speak very loudly and very publicly about what really needs to be done. There are people who've gone through their own lived experience. I mean, I look at Dan Carden, and we struck up a friendship before crossing the floor.
Left-wing Labour MP, yeah.
From Liverpool.
Yeah.
So being a Manchester-based Tory MP at the time, it seemed an unusual one. But from his personal instance, my family instance, we got chatting and did joint interviews, joint campaigns, and we even got to meet Kate Middleton on the back of it for trying to destigmatise addiction. But it's that lived experience which is so important. So when anyone comes forward with their own story, we need to give them a platform to deliver that, really.
Finally, do you think politics and Parliament could be a better place if there were more friendships from across parties and less tribalism, I suppose?
I mean, short answer is yes. Consensus, compromise isn't a dirty word. Unfortunately, I think it has become in the last few years, and we generally have lost the art to disagree. I mean, we can always find parts we agree on, and especially when you agree on, the ends, just not the means. Find that common ground. There is a lot more that unites everyone than divides us. But the one key thing which we need to really grasp with it is compassion. People go through the worst kind of histories, and there are those in Parliament, there are those outside, and you don't know anyone's background until you talk to them. Offer that compassion. If you need a hug, give them a hug. But just be there, be prepared to listen, and if you do disagree, find a way to do so respectfully.
Christian Wakeford, Labour MP for Bury
South.
South. Thank you.